Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2025, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Accessibility Cloud and Intopia. You can follow us on Mastodon and Blue Sky, and if you have any questions for the presenter, post them using the ID24 hashtag, or you can use the YouTube chat. We'll gather your questions for our Q&A at the end of the session. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. I'm delighted to be joined by my guest host, Lauren. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ian. I am so excited to be able to introduce Piper Hutson, who will be talking about designing neuro-accessible interfaces for better user engagement. Over to you, Piper.
Wonderful. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Piper Hutson, and I specialize in neuroarts, cognitive neuroscience, and accessibility. I live outside St. Louis, Missouri, and I am a Caucasian cisgender female with red hair, currently in a 1940s curled poodle updo. Today, I'm wearing a Fantastic Beasts print dress and Beskar Mandalorian lightsaber earrings. I say this because details matter. The way we describe and present ourselves is a large part of our identity and belonging. And if you're neurodivergent like me, you may recognize you dress for extra micro dopamine hits. I came into this work for multiple co-occurring neurodivergencies, and when my brain started really finding difficult filtering and prioritizing visual information, I noticed that the more conversations with UX and neurodivergents who are in tech, there were often these common occurrences of busy pages, flashing ads, and all these other barriers that stopped me from enjoying websites. That lived reality really helps drive my research and makes me question things along the lines of how do digital environments help shape our cognition? Is there a chance that we can scaffold, not sabotage, the way our brains engage with digital surfaces? And so that is what really led to the consideration of designing neuroaccessible interfaces. I first must begin by the conversation of neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is the idea that brains are naturally variable, that autism, ADHD, dyslexia, even acquired brain injuries are not inherently deficits. They're just different ways of processing. They are adaptations to a human brain that has experienced the world in a different way. And neuroscience supports this. It shows that fMRI studies have different neurological pathways in our brains that solve the same task. Some brains recruit the dorsolateral prefrontex very heavily, while others more rely on parietal occipital networks. And neuroplasticity is the term I'll be using when we have the ability for these environments to help shape better patterning in our brain, where we can begin to adapt to our experiences. And so neurodiversity is the social concept of the adaptability of the human brain. And there are those neurodivergents whose brains haven't followed what the research and the science that often backs our UX research of how the different ways cognitive processing can affect our complete experience in the digital world. So the agenda for today is going to be talking about neuroaccessibility and why this work matters. Our brains in context. There are so many amazing ways our brains have changed, adapted, adjusted to sensory load, fast-paced experiences, and those differ across different people. Designing for cognitive load. There are going to be principles in neuroscience backed thanks to the Microsoft Toolkit that helps us understand different ways to use tech and these universal design and best practices, along with AI used respectfully, and creating these abilities to have stories, agencies, and actionable steps to make what we consider neuro-inclusive ways of weaving science with what you actually do. So I've mentioned neurodiversity as a term that has a neurodivergent route, where a brain that has experienced different processing routes over time have changed the way they interact with the world. You often see that ADHD can have dysregulated dopamine, so that frontal striatal network in our brain can become distracted or have difficulty sustaining attention due to that network of dopamine. Autistics often have altered connectivity between prefrontal and their parietal regions. That means shifting between attention takes a lot more cognitive energy, and therefore their brain is going to prefer predictability and routine. Dyslexia has reduced efficiency in what we know as the visual word form area of the brain. And this causes visual crowding, slower decoding, difficulty with multiple typefaces, all to become barriers. And parietal lobe injury, traumatic brain injury, long COVID, we're now considering as well, being an acquired neurodivergence, where there are parts of the brain that have been disrupted in their filtering, in their identity making, and sensory unload, and have created other routes to handle it. What we can do is instead of ignoring these characteristics that could cause immense amount of friction in UX design and enjoying a website, it's going to see that design could support cognitive relief. So I've mentioned the different type of barriers that we can see from neurodivergent characteristics. All brains are different. When you start defining the brain with stereotypes, it does get very tricky, but we do see that there are a lot of commonalities that could be supported by connecting with different techniques. Complex navigation is going to have a huge impact on those who have multiple sensory sensitivities. If their brain is overloaded by sensory information, they're less likely to hold on to neuro information from the environment or the digital content. Communication styles. Everyone prefers their own way of vocalizing their needs, but some find their brains don't like to actually do that. So, nonverbal communication, writing over oral information is going to see something very common between that population. And just understanding that our brain has different routes that can take similar task management is a new way of perspective while you build different tech advantages. There are lots of ways that this is being talked about as neurodiversity has become kind of a catchphrase within some tech companies. And what's beautiful is it does give us this opportunity to discuss access, to discuss cognitive support levels. If we're considering that those who identify and can be data quantified have a 15 to 20% rate in our population, we have to know that there's going to be those who don't have access, don't feel like disclosing, and a much higher number within fields that support the type of brain processing we see. I have to say, I quite enjoy tech people for the science mathematical way their brain goes about and finds that the brain has multiple different avenues for different tech structure and coding, even amongst neurodivergent brains. And these brains can change. For those who identify as a female and have hormonal changes, we're seeing a giant influx of premenopausal and menopausal women whose brains are no longer functioning in the same way as they used to. And quite simply, those who are fatigued, exhausted, parents, those who are taking care of older parents, all of these things create a strain on our brain, and that causes a drain in cognitive energy. Digital environments, if they're too clustered, if they're overwhelming, if they're hard to read, actually cause pain in some brains that can't identify cognitive strain from internal pain atoms. And this just really highlights how important understanding user-friendly design is. So adjustable variable settings is one of the ways that many people find an overcoming possibility to enjoying tech. Complex navigational structures, as I've mentioned, actually have damage to the basal ganglia, and that's which automates our habits. If it cannot create new patterns, especially if things are moving, like if menus are moving too fast when you go to them, it will pause and stop. Overwhelming sensory stimuli, we have a thalamus in our brain that will then flood the cortex, and that means that the filter will become flashing and noisy, and it won't be able to decipher which sensory information is most important to keep. Information overload. Our hippocampus, that is where we store our memories, and it cannot consolidate working data if it is overwhelmed. So these barriers aren't just annoying for neurological complications. This is actually a breakdown in how the brain is interacting with the design. And the impact of digital exclusion. We are in a time period where inclusion is its own tricky word, and understanding that for some, not being able to interact with a digital experience is going to cause them to withdraw. We will see that they have higher cognitive stress levels when they are unable to interact in a way that makes them feel the same cognitive belonging that they might amongst themselves, alone, or in a group that they have psychological safety with. This will only exacerbate isolation, issues with identity construction, and obviously, you can't build a community if you're always sad and overwhelmed by your brain. I'm very grateful to the Microsoft's Inclusive Design Kit. They started presenting the understanding of cognitive load in a way that was digestible. And so their inclusive design immediately recognized the understanding of exclusion and started to treat mismatches of a user to the programming as a design flaw they needed to fix. Learning from diversity, so co-designing with neurodivergent users, actually considering that neurodivergents amongst themselves have different processing, and therefore they're the quickest to find the flaws, the errors, because they're simply trying to make it work for themselves. Solve for one, extend to many, also known as the curb effect. When you create something with an intent to be accessible for a particular population, it almost always has a reverberating wave effect in a way you didn't expect. And what we see is even the integration of dyslexia fonts help a vast array of different brains. Today I was just recently confirming my accessible slides, and Google Copilot animated the use of play. So the font that you see today is even brand new to me on accessibility coming from Google with play. I usually use Aptos, which again is a wonderful inclusion of Microsoft, where they understood that harsh single lines can be too much. So Aptos has a curve to it. I have yet to look long enough at play to understand its inclusion capabilities, but I'm curious if there are any designers here who can give me insight into that. The principles of universal design. I really started this work from my own frustrations trying to communicate the different way my brain interacted in all sorts of environments, and found that it was in the tech sphere that they were most interested in listening to adaptivity, inclusivity, and understanding sometimes inclusion is innovation. So what the Microsoft Toolkit did was they did audits. They had their users and they had their coders test frequently, especially if they identified and were willing to disclose of being neurodivergent. Training on cognitive variety. Once you understand the intensity of cognitive load, you realize how important simplified user design is. And with any positive solution, you get feedback loops to figure out how to continuously improve. And this makes things accessible for all. You're using this idea of universal design. You are understanding that you need to adapt or be preemptively aware of what the needs are instead of after the effect, knowing how to support. Simplicity and clarity. And we see authoritativeship of the brain to get to choose what it wants to do in a digital pathway. This leads to a further breakdown of what I've been mentioning as cognitive load theory. Cognitive load theory is understanding how the brain processes, transfers, and manages information in order to optimize the lowest amount of cognitive energy for accessible data knowledge. We've seen that there are heavy studies into breaking it down from intrinsic load, that is the overall task complexity, the extraneous load, that's the avoidable friction that could be removed from a poor design if it was retailored with universal design considerations, and germane load, that is the effort that it takes to deepen understanding. The neuroscience overlay of this is intrinsic load engages the prefrontal. Neurodivergence, that's where we struggle the most, is blood flow, activation, dopamine, attention span, all dedicated into where our brain evolves last, the prefrontal. And this is going to also engage the parietal lobes. That's where we process our understanding of sensory information. So if you consider all of these brain networks being overloaded by bad design, it makes immediate sense how you would want to consider simplifying so that you don't burn out these processing networks. And that's what extraneous load does. It causes these attention networks to overload, which raises the body's cortisol. Germane load, that ability to have design that leads a user to authoritatively choose what they need and to reach completion, whether it is finishing a webinar, doing a form, or activating a technological support question just in a chatbot. This is going to strengthen the hippocampal encoding. That means it gets stored in long-term memory. It's worked. It's succeeded. You've done it. You successfully did the task. You get the reward of that dopamine for doing so, and stored in the memory is that process of how it occurred. Design principles then remove the noise, pace the complexity, and cultivate the learning. That's what the brain needs. Not just neurodivergent brains, really all brains. So I've mentioned the barriers in digital design. Failures of design through multiple overabundance of information, large text panels, and one that's very big for me is the altering of font types. That one is, oh, my brain's already sending me cortisol because it hates that so much. This means that there's going to be brain exhaustion. And when the brain has exhaustion, it's going to have cascading effects. Walls of text could be simplified by AI enhancements. Artificial intelligence is a tricky topic when it comes to technological advancements, but for those who find the lessened cognitive load that AI is able to give, their brains are so grateful it is now an accessibility tool. So for those who occasionally look at the downside, the negativity, the potential stereotyping, the bias, there is the positives of those who are able to populate AI with their own data, their own cognitive research, in order to help lessen their internal cognitive loads. And that's similar to what we're trying to do when we create adaptive interfaces. I begun this work in a museum field and saw the overwhelming potential of tech to help those whose brains are overloaded in a physical environment. And it became very apparent that if you give people the choice and the ownership to take the time to figure out what their brain needs, it will create that hippocampal memory, and then you will have a stronger sense of identity and connection to your prefrontal. Our prefrontal is where our identity is constructed, it is kept, and it's not questioned. And so when we have these opportunities for technology to step in for a brain that may overprocess, may short circuit, may go into a shame spiral, we're seeing that technology actually has the capability to help as a health measure when used properly. Walls of text, as I mentioned, are one of the first ways that access overviews of tech reviews have shown that the overload of working memory gets buffered when there's too much to process. Inconsistent navigation, so strain on pattern recognition networks, which is one of the reasons that most coders in text adore being mathematical, is the ability to create, define, and replicate. But when you have inconsistent navigation, it is going to stop those processes of sequencing and then expecting outputs that are positive. Sensory overload, this is one that I have the most amount of research on, being a neurodivergent mom in a neurodivergent household, when we have children who are at different spectrums of sensory processing. It is difficult to have a one size fits all when there are so many different opportunities for the brain to adapt. And there are some that need extra sensory information, and there are some that find it overloading. So having tools, being aware of the adaptability of different design faces, different typefaces, not using color just for certain points. 1 in 11 men cannot see red. So accessibility on the cognitive front is more than just UX design. It goes all the way to the colors that are used. Microsoft, among many, has a great adaptive tool now that can help you always color check, whether it is from those who have low vision, from those who are overloaded by lack of contrast. And as my work has grown into older cognitive processing, we see that within dementia and Parkinson's, the misuse of color can be extremely damaging to the brain. So a well-structured interface that is adaptive and can reduce stress signals actually frees the brain to focus, to recognize, to process, and to save. Some of the case studies that I have seen do this have illustrated, oh, my apologies, have illustrated that exhaustion from information access can be minimized. Social isolation can be minimized when you see how um, crowdsourcing other brains' inputs can be vital at creating a community that feels welcome in a digital space. And it creates the opportunity for more community engagement. If they don't feel comfortable navigating a space, they will never relax in the space enough to first gather knowledge and then share knowledge, which is a act of vulnerability in today's world. And so case studies include measurable ROIs. We're seeing huge gaps in cognitive data processing. And one of my favorites is the reduced motion in UI. We're thankfully moving away from automatic plays, and it was great to have the tech question if I have any vocal or visual automatic starts. I never do, because not only is that a tech exhaustion, it is a cognitive exhaustion for not only the presenters to make sure it's ready, but if you're unprepared as a viewer, you have to realign your sensory processing in that moment. So reduced UX improves retention for many brains, but the most case studied is autistic brains. We've seen that through eye tracking. There is a local STL, I live outside of St. Louis group, that is actually doing eye tracking to help identify dyslexia and dementia. So the opportunities to recognize the processing through the orbital lobes has taken on a new technological spin, which I'm very excited to see. Dyslexia-friendly fonts. I mentioned that Aptos is preferable for myself. The serifs, if you consider that every line you see takes extra cognitive energy to process, then adding little line feet is additional lines and shadows and angles. So sans serifs are helpful for a reason. The Aptos with the curve, some people will notice their brain prefers curves, some will prefer lines, and that may affect their literacy. Dyslexia-friendly fonts, not only for eye tracking, but we're seeing the opportunity for people to pick a typeface that is easiest cognitive loads on their own brains. So now the potential of adjusting your set to recognize your optimal optical intake and then adjusting based off of font choice, size, and preference could even vary in the future. Simplified navigation. As wonderful it is to have lots of videos and lots of pictures, we are now overabundantly aware of data, and simplification is what our brain prefers when it comes to reading on our digital screens. Increased task completion when things are auto-populated, they're dropped down, especially for ADHD users. When you have predictive or remember abilities such as password keep and password key, the cognitive stress of remembering, of finding the passwords The amount of times that I have not purchased something because the website didn't remember my login password is probably best for my bank account. But again, ROI and intensity of doing what the website needs goal-wise needs to make sure that these things are aligned if they're reaching the level of potential. And they're not theoretical. These implementations, these considerations, adaptive contexts, adaptive interfaces, and executive functioning aids are all giving valuable insights of how these are truly creating longer lasting interaction, more task definition and understanding knowledge retention. And coming from a previous corporate world, I always am aware of the monetary needs of having tech done correctly prior to it being launched, and then, of course, prior to being accessibility checked. Um, there is a slightly dangerous move we see of going one step further of brain on chip in the brain accessibility and neurotech. As fascinating as it is, we are seeing these frontiers creating the potential of user-centric experiences, but often the population data is accumulated from neuronormative scientific perspectives. Um, those who have been healthy, those who've had access to healthcare, those who have often grown up in the middle class, usually Caucasian and very often male, do drive the neurological stats that many companies are using to create these brain-on-chip models. The output is hoping that user-centric will go to predicting how cognitive load manifests in real time. I worked with a Canadian institution that used biometrics, so monitoring the brain wave spectrums in the workplace to help them recognize when they were having stress markers. This was a really common request after COVID when people were returning to the office, and many neurodivergents who had spent the last year in a psychologically perfected space, minimized social interaction, and their own preferential sensory intakes, found returning to an office environment really the start of their neurodivergent awareness journey. In Canada, they were hoping they could create a VR experience of the workplace environment to walk into prior. That's one of the ways that my early museum work partnered with technological sites is neuro system wise. We will be more acclimated and less likely to be triggered when our brain has experienced it prior. So the websites that organizations have, that museums create, have the opportunity to neurologically create a sense of safety in our bodies before being on site. So a VR walkthrough, a map of a place can have a neurological authoritative ship in constructing a sense of safety. These opportunities are wonderful, creating Eurocentric experiences, but we have to consider that we're in a controversial time period of data collection, perhaps not without our allowance. And so this is the time to be discussing the importance of neural data, the importance of sharing neural experiences, the importance of understanding what works and what doesn't on a grander scale. And I'm grateful for all of you who are listening, for those especially neurodivergents who understand that this could lead to awareness just of your own neurotype. The skill sets to identify your own typeface, your own color preferences, your own smells isn't something being embedded in our education. Those who are over outside of America, many have socialized medicine where neurodiversity is integrated into your healthcare. So accessibility is a bit more strenuous for those who are finding the importance and finding that their systems and the structures that they grew up in may not have advocated or supported. So there is opportunity for healing in just knowing how to properly code, which I greatly enjoy getting to tell tech people who may not realize the impact that they could be having. For neurodivergent users, simply asking is awesome. Being aware that many feel a great fear of disclosure, of being biased over the stereotype, of having enough concern that their brain actually stops working because they are so self-aware of being themselves in a space, and that cognitive energy drains their capacity to do what they love, which is code. So finding the people, understanding their brains enough to give them the chance to help support. And all you coders out there who have your own unique and eccentricities, this is my request for you to own them in this time and be loud. So if someone else doesn't know it, they may be able to see by your tech design, by your typeface collection, by your new tech that helps people better recognize what preferences they have. This means involving everyone, not just who you assume would work. We don't know how our brains work oftentimes until we see the opposite in someone else or we see the exact similar. And so that is a wonderful, unique crowdsourcing opportunity to simply be open and discussing, well, that website was too bright. Well, for some reason, when the arrow moved, I felt better. We start noticing that little things like haptic vibrations or a website that remembers your preferences will create a sense of calm in the user, even those from older generations who are instilled with tech fear. So the effectiveness of digital designs is more than just a neurodivergent bucket. When we consider that the human brain can go from a neuronormative to being tired, you've got a cold, you've got COVID, you've got young kids, you get a heart attack or a stroke, you have an accident with your hand. All of these things with accessibility shows that at any given point in time, what you need may change. So having adaptive, predictive, and understanding tech helps. What I mean by adaptive context, just in case it needs to be further defined, is simplify. The less differences, the easier the brain will visually read it. Reflow, reorganize how things are flowing, the adjusting of having on a device versus a screen is something I'm seeing uh, university students struggle with their course load. The old academic tools are outdated for the modern TikTok users. So it goes even down to helping them understand how to adapt to their educational technology needs. Adaptive interfaces, if you are familiar with getting a headache because something was too bright, having to adjust to a dark mode, reducing motion or making sure there are no unexpected animations on a page, then you already know how nice it is when something remembers what you needed the previous time. And executive functioning aids. In many instances, the idea of the Microsoft Cognitive Toolkit and cognitive load really focused on the brains who are getting the most research data of autism and ADHD, which are largely based in executive functioning. What we say in America would be difficulty because of the medicalized framework of it. But when we consider that it's just a different distractibility, overlapping, overabundant neural network, it makes it a little easier, hopefully, to consider that task chunking could work for some brains instead of being overwhelming or leaping in. We have those baby steps. This can be seen in instead of a full form, you go through the questions instead of seeing them all at once. Being given the option to see all the questions at once versus having to go through adaptability. So I caution that as we question personalized cognitive support through tools, we also consider the worrisome nature that I mentioned when it comes to brain-on technologies and emerging technologies, biometric data, that is the data that our body can provide to tech to give us insights. That's everything from an Apple Watch that tells you your steps, tells you your heart rate is going too high. That is brain scans, ECGs, or biometric headsets that can recognize if you are paying attention, if you're stressed, or if your eyes are diverting. These are becoming quite popular in corporate environments and in other ways for assisting productivity of their employees, but there are currently no unified laws or exact processing of this collective amount of brain data. So that's something I'm very cautious of is it does raise privacy concerns of how we're collecting people's information, what we're using eye tracking data for, how we are defining stereotypical neurotypes to provide such data and therefore ROI measures. And ROI in neuroaesthetics. Neuroaesthetics is modifying our environment from everything, the colors that we see on the wall, to the type of chairs that are used, to the designs of hospital beds. Every single thing that is designed affects our brain. It is going to have a potential manipulative engagement based off of our preferences, based off of design ethics, and based off of our environment. Neuroscience tells us that adaptive tools have the potential to mimic our brain's own external scaffolding. I know that there is a publication that is getting a lot of hype that AI will make our brains slower. For the neurodivergents who are just now finding out that their brains aren't always slow and that AI can actually help us create ideas from language to concepts that we are unable to present. I would question the data on that study as we see the potential new neuroplasticity markers that are occurring in neurodivergents who didn't feel a sense of identity or authoritativeship until these tech additions have been created. So, um, overviewing yet again a lot of information. If cognitive processing is new to you, apologies for my joy of specifically discussing the anatomical. Neurologically, I find my brain feels more authoritativeship in my own body if I am able to pinpoint exactly what's occurring in my brain. And this is an opportunity for all of those tech people who get frustrated but don't know why to force their tech brains to start questioning in order to design better. Design with cognitive load in mind. That means minimizing extra noise, pace intrinsic difficulty. Don't overwhelm if you can avoid it with too many choices of fonts or colors or any animations. Scaffold, that's your main load. That's the load where the design that you have presents the information enough to not overwhelm the brain to find the decision making more difficult. Decision making goes in the prefrontal. If you have a population that's perpetually trying to stay present and to keep blood to their prefrontal, you could be having a website that could actually be causing cognitive harm. So give users control. That means not assuming everyone wants to have motion, pictures, video that automatically starts. The potential understanding that some tech is going to be read easier by the human brain, everything from typeface to text to placement, and having those navigational pathways. Autonomy stabilizes the brain's stress circuits. If your brain is stressed, it will not be able to make a decision in the capacity that many want. That can lead to not only frustration of using it, but then being mad at your own brain for not functioning up to the standard you're assuming you need based off of design in the outside world. Bring neurodivergent voices in, be curious, and be willing to learn. Every time I do this presentation, I am gifted by new insights by the crowds, by their questions that allow me to adapt to better understand the own research. I am a researcher by heart, a professor, a corporate art curator, and now a writer who's obsessed with how the brain interacts in our world. and helping neurodivergents understand so they can be a little nicer to themselves. And all of these things mean that design is neurodesign. If everything we interact with is going to affect our processing, our self-worth, our identity construction, our memory construction, then you're either scaffolding that information, that cognitive processing, or you're sabotaging it with your design. So thank you so much for spending this time with me. And I gave a lot of time for questions. So apologies if you wanted to hear me talk more about a particular topic, but I'm kind of hoping I could learn a little bit more from your questions. Um, are there any questions we can add to the mix?
There certainly are. Thank you very much, Piper. I'll hand over to Lauren for the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. So Piper, that was great. Thank you so much. Really, really cool talk and really personal to me as well. So thank you. Our first question is for dyslexia-friendly text, how does spacing and flow, like centering text, factor versus typefaces?
So I think in that, the only real information that I currently have data on is when I'm working with older populace who need more spacing and larger letters. When it's come to my university students, I don't see a lot of need for character distancing, although I do see the preference for not double space, which is something that older generation preferred were large double spaces. So I would say that the font would be most impactful. Dyslexia is directly linked to differences in the brain's fusiform gyrus, which is the visual word form area. In discussions with other neurodivergent moms who are disappointed in our education system's lack of dyslexia identification and testing, we discovered that the unaware nature of cognitive load through the amount of lines was one of the things that was troubling one student when her brain kept overloading with serif text, and then she had sans serif and she was fine. There's a group in India that's struggling immensely with the fact that most of their languages aren't letter-based. And how do you test for dyslexia when there are culturally historic alphabets that are more pictograms? So text is significant and that there is an open dyslexic text that I adore that actually chooses to chooses to bold certain letters and reduce certain, and the cognitive load our brain automatically fills in instead of reading it. So the first time that I was fully aware of the impact of cognitive load for dyslexic fonts was Open Dyslexic. Now there's another one known as LexInd. But clear sans serifs like Arial, Veranda, and Tacoma are standard when we see letter differentiation. But line spacing, generous character and word spacing can ease the load, but I haven't seen it be a preference in the groups that I've done dyslexic work with.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So our second question is for cognitive exhaustion, what are your thoughts on negative space?
Ooh. Ooh. Well, the first thing I want to know is the negative space a certain color? Like, is the negative space white or black? Because then technically, if it's black, it's not negative space. It's still absorbing that emission of black. Um, uh, the prefrontal contact cortex is the one that has the most frustration with exhaustion. So that's why I get so much more frustrated as a neurodivergent, because for a neurotypical who has no issues keeping the prefrontal engaged, it wouldn't be the same level of exhaustion. Their brain just wouldn't find it that way. But for those who are exhausted, especially those who may not be self-aware enough to recognize the exhaustion is due to tech, not their own brain, that then could lead to amygdala reaction. And it's once that amygdala hits, that's when the trouble starts. That's when you have the sensory overload. That's when you have the shame. That's when you have people who have the flashing overload when their brain gets too much. That's the migraines. The amount of individuals I've met who later discovered their migraines were due to them trying to push through their sensory overload. If you don't know your brain is exhausted because you aren't familiar with how your brain is running, then exhaustion leads to withdrawal. Your brain goes, I don't want to do this. It's easier to not be involved. And that has negative health and social outcomes. Not to mention the way we talk to ourselves when we assume we're at fault. So, exhaustion has multiple layers when it comes to cognitive design, but there are multiple fixes that could prevent that conversation.
Fantastic, thanks. And then our next question comes from Ian.
Hello. Yeah, I have a question
Oh,
for you. Sort of
fancy.
kind of
Straight from the source. All right.
I think this question might resonate with a few people, but it's sort of more on the sort of personal side, I guess, for individuals, which is like how someone diagnosed as neurodivergent in my 40s. I'll give you a trivial example would be of this, but how do you identify as an individual what is neurodivergence? There's assumption you don't know well, there is no definition of what neurotypical is, right? So you don't know
Yes.
what everyone is experiencing versus what you're experiencing. And like I say, the sort of trivial example is that I used to think that the phrase like picture in your mind was just a turn of phrase until I learnt about aphantasia.
Oh,
And then I
oh,
went,
yes.
oh, I have aphantasia, right? So
Oh,
you don't know
oh,
what
so
you
you
don't
can't see
know.
in your mind.
Right. Nothing. No, nothing at all.
Fascinating. Oh, I'm so delightful. You're the third person that I've met this month with it, and the nuance is that it's such a rarity. Um, our second book, and I'm always willing to, especially for students or neurodivergent, send digital copies over. Our second book was specifically discussing artists that had
Mm.
synesthesia. So the crossover of sensory experiences. Many don't know they have synesthesia. If your brain hears a color, I say here's a color. If your brain sees a color when you hear something, if you have the same reaction to the letter A, if your brain has an unusual overlayer between feeling something or hearing something, that's a particular synesthesia crossover. And until we met artists and asked them to describe their brain, we didn't realize that at the very nature of many neurodivergent artists is their particular way of seeking their art is a direct result of trying to figure out how their brain is engaging in the world. And it became quite confusing when the more tech people I met had no visual information, when all the artists I was meeting said that they could live in their brain and have stories and worlds, which is where I sit, is that my cognitive delay often comes from the fact that my brain processes everything first as pictures, and then I have to find the words to describe what the pictures are telling me. And that's visual dyslexia, is the visual nodes of the words is what causes me trouble. And many neurodivergents, this is one easy way to, I say neurodivergent because it is a reclaiming positive term, whereas in
Yeah.
America, the diagnosis or DSM criteria can vary quite vastly from a positive neurodivergence diagnosis over in the UK. So I try not to specifically do any diagnosis word ties, but for neurodivergence, usually their brain will be processing visual information at an extreme overload. That means that colors, which all just form in our brain based off of shadows and variances in light, everything is constructed at a much more frequent rate of higher sensory information. And brain scans have shown that neurodivergent brains don't kick out things they need, so they don't prune their memories as often. So if you have a brain that walks into a zoo and sees a tiger, your brain might go, tiger in a cage, safe. Versus a neurodivergent brain may walk into a zoo, hear all the noise, smell all the sights, see a tiger, go, holy crap, tiger. And then go, I'm in a zoo, it's behind a cage. And then it may go, well, remember Tiger Book when you were 5? Remember the Jungle Book? Those were all just stories. And then 5 minutes later, you go, just a tiger. That is the neurological cognitive load processes of a neurodivergent brain. It's getting more information because it's noticing all the fluctuations. It's having a larger amount of memory feed pullback to then connect to the information in the mode. And then it's going, all right, you've got more brain processing than ever. Let's not talk to your body for a minute. It's for you to then have to remember, oh, no, 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 my body's here too. I got to recognize that. Neurodivergents use proprioception more than neurotypicals. That's our need to gain information through movement. We're the movers, we're the shakers, we're the twitchers, we're the pickers, we're the twirlers. Literally because our brains need more sensory information in an environment, and it's forcing us to get that by moving because our body has to also give us information since our brain's overloaded by the visual. That's how you know you're neurodivergent. If you heard that and it all made sense to you, that's neurodivergent. If you heard that and you went, oh my God, that sounds awful and exhausting, you're likely a neurotypical.
I guess there's going to be quite a few people in our audience, so I'll be feeling that. Well, thank you very much. That was fantastic, Piper. Really, really interesting. And we could talk about this for hours, I think. Lauren, thank you very much for hosting with me. So if you liked this session, please hit the YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to our channel to be kept in the loop on our future events. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our Platinum supporters, Accessibility Cloud and Intopia, our Silver supporters, Intuit, and our Bronze supporters, the Law Office of Laney Feingold, Mantis & Co, and Vispero. We will be back on the hour with our next session. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you then.